Thank you, Margaret. As to reading all my great qualifications, if you did Niels and Tom and Barkley and myself, we'd be here all day, but we're very humble men. And so I appreciate, Margaret, you know how much I adore the opportunity to speak with you and work with Raed and the wonderful folks that have been in these cohorts so far. I'm going to speak on the topic of ethical dependability as being a cornerstone of AI safety. And there are four areas of discussion. And I do invite discussion or comments as we go along. And of course, Margaret, you and Raed can monitor the chat. First, I'd like to share about the QM foundations for AI use cases, and then on to learning, ethics, and the cost of the failures of ethics. Then I would like to share a little bit about the AI risks and the three principles of law that will guide us through this. I've enjoyed the previous presentations very much. I can see that together we bring a really holistic, comprehensive, yet properly detailed vision of what we're dealing with in AI, what our responsibilities are, and what the outcomes can be. Of course, we know a lot of the outcomes are unknown, but we can determine quite effectively some of the inputs, and I've appreciated the various comments that I've heard so far. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit, very briefly, about AI safety and designing intelligent systems, because at that point, I'm going to depend on the listeners to bring to the fore your concerns about AI safety. And one of the things that is mentioned repeatedly today is the importance of the individual human being. And an intelligent system is the proper pairing of a competent human being with the right technologies. My learning curve so far on AI has been very, very interesting. I'm learning to argue with my AI agent and get much better at my prompting. I've noticed that it will give me what I ask for most of the time, but once in a while it decides to hallucinate and try to sound relevant and try to sound competent when it is not. And so one of the most important things about using AI is the individual has domain knowledge, experience, and a profile of understanding that will allow us to evaluate the input we receive from AI. So it's been a really great and interesting path of learning for me. And I hope by the time I get to the end of the conversation here or my presentation, that you'll have a lot of inputs that will bring together all of the things that you've heard today and some that I've heard today on the safety issues. When we speak of quality management, we speak of an educational technology with systems, methods, and language, all of which are designed to help you reach your business goals. Margaret, you mentioned that I began in aerospace and very much involved in the Apollo program and things like that. And we had business goals. The first business goals was to reach the moon and get back safely with our crew. Most people wouldn't consider that a business goal, but when you're in the business of developing high-level technologies and your success, your funding depends on the public's perception of that, your ability to fulfill your high promise that John Kennedy made, and to develop it in such a way that it raises the confidence of the public in what you're doing. It is a business goal. Economics control process. You have to have the finances, the human resources, the technologies, all the things that make up these enormously complex processes. So the quality management foundations are based on very well-defined methods. I've heard several references to QA, putting good things into a process, doing testing or whatever is required on the positive side, and on quality control, which is taking bad things out of the process through all kinds of tests and reviews and audits and so on and so forth. And then there are the QM values, which are a wide range of things that include personal values, professional values, process values, and ethics, all kinds of things like that that lead us to the ability with our commonly shared knowledge and our own vocational certainty to have reasonable discussions. And those reasonable discussions are intended to allow us or enable us to create reasonable standards for whatever project or whatever domain of activity that, for instance, if we're trying to set a regulatory frame over it or what have you, it allows us to create good solutions for the design and management of what it is we're doing, product or service, or like I said, some governmental agency trying to bring safety and other issues to the forefront, and how to market and place these things in the public. Having started back in Apollo, at the time I didn't fully realize how much PR was involved and how much of it required accurate dissemination of information. We call it transparency. We also depend on the accurate facts to determine whether or not we want to support things, whether or not they're important to us. There's a lot of discussion on all of these topics, like setting a standard for AI. Well, that'll be interesting to see as that battle begins. Design and management of them and what their outcomes should be, and the marketing and placement of theirs. Everyone has an opinion. I have mine, you have yours. And together, it's interesting when we put all of our concerns together and our potential solutions, they start to make a little bit of sense to me. The challenge for leadership in today's marketplace is the same as it's always been, and that's keeping our promises to our customers. We say things to people that are warranties, whether they're implied or specific, about the quality of our products and services. And we say things that are promises and warranties about the reliability of our customer service responses and how we help people understand the usage of what we've given them, particularly in the technology area. It's been my understanding and my own discovery process that technology suppliers do not a very good job of that. We always find that people are underutilizing the technologies they have, not always, but often. They're underutilizing the technologies they have because they haven't been properly informed, instructed, so on and so forth. Now, there are lots of reasons for that, but the very wide evidence of people underutilizing their technologies also leads to a sort of vague or blind opinion on such things as AI. And I know from my own experience, until I got some really good coaching on this from Barclay Brown, as a matter of fact. We worked together on several projects and are really in the process now of writing a thesis, a book on quality management and AI and how they are very much reciprocating if properly engaged. They have a great reciprocal power to them. This involves everything in terms of the services, the products, how we build them, how we execute them, how we explain ourselves to our customers. But the real problem for leadership is hiring and training reliable people. It's been mentioned a couple of times already. The important issue here is not just the proper design and implementation of the technology, but the people involved in all of the process, from the design and implementation to the purchase and the application of these wonderful things. I personally think that AI is going to add 5 to 7 years of productivity to my life. I'm probably in the last quarter or the last 10%, I'm not sure. But I've found it to be a very reliable researcher for me because I'm able to apply my domain knowledge, and where I don't have domain knowledge, to make good judgments about the return input from AI. I'm able to ask good questions, and I'm able to ask them without any concern about the perception about my question being feeble or strong or whatever. And I have learned to get really good information by sort of cross-examining what AI gives me. But hiring and training people who are going to engage in the use of AI and in the development of products and services is an essential element. I hear people say often that AI is going to cost people their jobs. We can go all the way back to the Luddites and the Industrial Revolution. Technologies, for the most part, reduce the workforce size almost every time there's a new advancement. There's a sort of a sorting process that takes place. And I like what somebody said the other day. They said, AI might not take away your job, but somebody using AI more effectively than you are could take away your job. But it would be an important upgrade for each individual. Now, there are always going to be people when we have these industrial leaps forward who are sort of left behind. And that's an unfortunate thing. There's been competition since the first men were rolling around as hunters and gatherers and created a wheel and a cart so that they could advance their work day. These things are part of human elements, and they're part of human thinking and the desire to do better, which is very, very common. However, everyone has a story about supposedly reliable people, companies as well, who have failed to keep their promise to us. And it sort of puts us in a spin. When we are particularly dependent on the reliability of a product and that it will perform as promised, and it does not, it causes us to start to question not only the product, but the people that delivered it. And if you're a manager or a professional who has to fulfill your promises to your customers through another employee's or many employees' efforts, many layers of managers and so on and so forth, you are going to be challenged by the lack of knowledge, skills, or ethics that you sometimes experience in the marketplace. I'm very much involved in a clinical research group that has written a standard, a global standard for clinical research sites. And I remember early on in my discussions with them, my concern about the amount of fraud that's taken place in clinical research. And a simple search on any kind of a search engine, and I've tried it on several, it's usually pretty much the same, as you know, will show that there has been a consistent history of fraud and misrepresentation. And I challenged the teams that we were part of to realize that at the end of the day, there are real people going to receive the outcome, the results of our work. Having come from a world in the Apollo program where we had, just as I came on board as a junior research engineer working for 12 specialists that were the very best in the field that were available to us. And we had just unfortunately lost the lives of 3 astronauts. And they used to say when I was first being trained, we killed these 3 guys. It seemed really harsh and really hard. But they wanted to embrace the fact that there were factors that weren't even their fault, that were already pretty much identified, that came together in an unusual sequence of events that caused the loss of 3 persons' lives. Not only that, it dominoed through the network. Everyone who was listening on the network or watching closely on CCTV at that time, it put us all in a state of shock. Many of those folks needed actual counseling and psychiatric help after that, not to mention the domino effect on our budget, on our business plans. We almost had the entire program shut down by the US Congress. So these things really do happen and they have consequences, but we have this continuing surfacing of this, I'll say, competency or lack of competency and lack of awareness and somewhat questionable skills that seems to be in some sectors, some domains that I'm involved in, growing. The question is why? Well, I want to talk about one of the possible solutions. I think there are many possible reasons, socially, economically, the way we design our business programs, as somebody was mentioning earlier. There are lots of things that have contributed to this continuing kind of eyesore on society. But the one I want to talk about is the learning process. Um, Bloom's taxonomy is a widely regarded description of how the learning process is most effectively described. And you can see here it has different levels, starting with recognizing and recalling facts. This is an essential thing to do, as particularly if you're in engineering or in clinical research or in the IT world, as you all. And all of these things are entirely dependent on reliable input of data and the proper manipulation of that data. And so there are certain principles and methods that we have to learn and we have to practice and be able to demonstrate that we can recall the facts, we can recall the formulas, we can recall the language inputs, and then demonstrate that we understand it, but not only apply it. So you can see you work your way through this process of applying and then having the ability to analyze and then evaluate and create. And parallel to that, in higher education in particular, but now particularly in the United States, it has moved down into the school systems, even mid school and high school, where the assessments run parallel to this, but there's been a degradation on the importance of recognizing and recalling facts, just basic learning. And some people say, oh, you shouldn't memorize. I say, well, I don't know. I need repetition sometimes before I gather an ownership of a fact. But however you do it and whatever method is used, you should be able to start out by properly and accurately recalling the facts related to your domain of study and then go through this process. And so there was this big reaction that I had a number of years ago when I was dealing with some higher learning experts, some academicians from around the world. And I've done a lot of work in the area of accreditation, from Joint Commission for Hospitals, accreditation of rehabilitation facilities, working with universities and their accreditation systems. And they started to move away from testing for knowledge. And they started to move toward assessing what they call the higher levels of assessment. And that's how it makes you feel when you encounter these facts. How does it make you feel X or Y or Z, restricted, enabled, floating in the air, wonderful? There were all kinds of, I'm being a bit ridiculous in my usage of terms here, but they wanted to move very quickly to the higher levels of assessment and into creativity long before the demonstration of competence was achieved and all of these other steps here. Now you can imagine what kind of gaps of knowledge that created and how many times you've been in a meeting where there was an obvious lack of the fundamentals in the person's um, uh, position or argument or their presentation or what have you. But the truth of it is, this has been going on for a long time, and I noticed it was about in 2005 or six, somewhere around in there, that academicians had sort of acquiesced to the higher levels of assessment, the feelings and so on and so forth were more important. Well, all you have to do is look at their processes and the output, where you have and I had this very specific example. I was teaching at an IBM conference with Barclay, as a matter of fact, and I was working along, and I made a statement like, "Well, I don't know if some of you guys had problems with, transistor theory. I had a little trouble with it at the beginning. It's really very clear and understandable. But for some reason, it was a little vague to me, and I had trouble." Figuring it out. And then all of a sudden, one day I got it, and I thought, well, I don't know why I had so much trouble learning that, but I did. And there was a young man, a couple of rows from the front, and he was from Georgia Tech, a renowned school for double E's, electrical engineers. And he said, well, yeah, Larry, he said, I can understand that. He said, but we don't pay that much attention to it because we don't use those anymore. We don't use them. And I said, transistors, you don't lose transistors? He said, yeah. Well, the whole room groaned because of the experienced people that were sitting around him. And I said, no, you use them by the trillions. And I explained to him how the technologies had advanced. And I said, you do know this. And he said, yeah, but I don't think of it that way. And I thought, I remember thinking, because there were all kinds of people buzzing, and you know how in a group they'll elbow each other and whisper each other. I wondered what they were thinking, because it expressed a gap of fundamental knowledge that was stunning. I had a situation where I was at the WHO a number of years ago, where the room was filled with MDs who also had PhDs in clinical research from about 30 countries. And they expressed their reticence about applying the scientific method. Now, these are researchers. And I said, well, why? And they said, because we consider it antiquated and restrictive. And so I explained to them how being restricted was part of its purpose, is that to keep us from making unintended, to creating unintended consequences, and so on and so forth. And they were quite surprised by that, because they said they were depending on the reliability of their relationships. And for those of us that have spent a good portion of our life testing the facts of everything in a quantitative way, in hardware and the data and the software and the people that we're dealing with, it was quite a shock to the room to realize that somehow they had incrementally moved from the importance of reliable facts and decision making. So it's one of the factors, I think, one of the important factors in what we see that's going on in the world right now, and a real concern that a lack of understanding of this will affect, as Pamela had said, our biases about how to make these decisions in the design and implementation of AI. QM leaders solve problems. We overcome barriers. It's a routine. There wouldn't be any need for quality managers and for the skills that we have, the ability to apply quantitative and qualitative measures the way we do, unless there were problems to solve, unless there were quality issues, unless there were production and process issues. We learn the facts, and then we apply systems thinking to create solutions. There's no place in that process for a person who hasn't matriculated through the levels of Bloom's in learning and application. There's places for learners, and as I was, as a young associate research engineer who was being constantly tutored, where they would take me aside privately and say, you asked this question. Why did you ask that question? And I'd say, because I don't know the answer to that. And I heard you say this and that. So I want to make sure I understand, so that I'm in sync with you, so that I can fulfill your requirements and sort of keep my job and the perception that I'm effective. And so I had this mentoring constantly going on. And so everyone has to grow through their process of understanding, whether you're an engineer, an IT executive, you're a business leader selling popcorn. It doesn't matter. You have these same problems because we're dealing with humans who create systems and processes to develop products and services that go to other humans. And so a good QM leader is doing this kind of thing and constantly learning facts and constantly growing in the ability to apply them. And these things are done within the scope of our authority and within the available resources. Sometimes our solutions result in a design that requires additional resources beyond our immediate reach. This is why we have decision matrices and hierarchy in authority in the workplace. So let's talk a little bit about the ethics here in terms of the definition of ethics. Ethics is not vague. It's it's a discipline dealing with what is good and bad. Oh my gosh, I just said good and bad. That's horrible, right? No. This is another thing that has dwindled the effectiveness of the hierarchy of Bloom's taxonomy, is that often you hear in the academic situation that there is no good or bad, or that it's a relative thing, that there are so much similarities between good and bad that it's really hard to make a decision along that line. Well, no, I don't think so. A customer knows when the product is not good, and we call that failing to fulfill the requirements that were made in the promise, and that's a bad thing. So the discipline is dealing with what is good and bad, and that means we have to accept the facts of what our customers are telling us. It's also, ethics is a system or a philosophy of moral values. Again, here's the hot button, good or bad, and moral. I don't want anybody telling me what my morals are. And I say, of course, every individual has the right to choose and speak, although the right to speak is being challenged around the world in various cultures. But the thing of it is, within a process, there are certain ethical and moral standards that we call process ethics. And you don't have a choice when you join a system that's working to produce through processes with specific requirements. You don't have a choice of violating those without acknowledging what you're doing. So you can do whatever you want at home. You can do whatever you want on your vacation. You can do whatever you want anywhere else. But when you've engaged and made a commitment to a process, you need to declare when you're out of sync, out of step, because that might be a helpful thing that you're declaring. You might give us an additional value or perception that will make our process more effective. But you can't just silently or in a resistance mode uh, declare your lack of moral conscience on this as being okay. It's the thing that we're dealing with. This is part of AI safety. What's moral for one person isn't moral for another. And I heard an argument online the other day between some AI professionals and really some of the founders and leaders now. And it was shocking to me how, on one hand, the one person said, well, I'm happy if AI turns out to be God. And the other person says, how can a non sentient thing be like God? And it went on and on and on. And I thought, they're lost in the wrong argument. They're not thinking about the customer, they're not thinking about the average person, and their high levels of creativity has, in many respects, or in some respects, driven them mad. So, the definition of wisdom is knowledge of what is true and right, coupled with good judgment. How can you possibly wisely choose how to design and implement these things without knowledge of what is true and right, good and bad, and couple it with good judgment that comes from that hierarchy of blooms going through the process, having experience and testing and evaluating, and eventually getting to the place where you can judge and create. Wisdom is an essential element into this world that we're about to step into, or I should say, we have stepped into, where AI is going to become a very important part of our daily routines. In our book, Keeping the Promise, that I wrote back in 2005, I talked about a work ethic for doing things right. Quality management is a work ethic in many respects. It's accumulation of various principles and language and so on and so forth. And we wrote about the 8 attributes of a quality manager, or how to develop a quality culture. I was mentored by Philip Crosby, one of Deming's colleagues, and Joran. Joran focused primarily, or substantially, I should say, on quantitative measures. Deming went both ways. Crosby leaned a little more toward developing the culture, but together they make a whole that's indisputably proven year after year, generation after generation. And when you ignore those attributes, you find yourself receiving on the wrong end of the process all of these error rates and sometimes despicable outcomes that we had no intention of creating. So ethical dependability is number 7 of the 8 attributes that we emphasize. And it's a quality manager administers money and all practical matters with ethical dependability. And that's proven over time. If you have all of these other learning experiences properly integrated into your life, you've matriculated through education, you've got a CV with really good experience in it, it starts to show up in your life. And whether or not you've been guided by what is good and bad. You've had some moral compass to help you. Um, it shows up in your leadership, and you're able to manage money, which is the important part of economic process. Economics is much more than the money and the empirical data. It has a lot more of a social science attached to it because it's the tug of war, it's the pull and the push, and the arguments and the discussions and the final decisions on how and why we exchange our assets, money for a product or service, or in barter or what have you. So ethical dependability is really at the heart of effective process management and our ability to relate not only to our customers, but to the world around us. The cost of ethical failures are theft, fraud, and other criminal acts. When we think of ethical failures, often folks will say to me, "Oh, well, yeah, we had an ethical failure, um, uh, and it cost us this amount of money." I remember studying one ethical failure in clinical research. This is going back to a few years ago when I was deeply researching this. And I found out that there was a cloning experience, and you all may remember this. This fellow from Asia decided he had cloned a goat, and he hadn't, and he knew he hadn't, but he managed to misrepresent the facts and get some grants. I think he had total grants close to $500 million, grants and investments and stuff. It was a gigantic failure. He'd passed some money around to various researchers who reproduced his studies. It, they just weren't happening. It was completely fraud. He even spent some money with some FDA officials and got them to say, "Oh yeah, this is great and wonderful." And so it was like the emperor had no clothes. There were a lot of good research sitting around saying, "Wait a minute, there's no way this part of the science passes muster." So with that comes legal liability and moral responsibility. So the cost of ethical failures are going to show up in AI as we develop AI, as we start to apply it, as we start to act on the outcomes that or the information it provides us. These things are going to surface. And when you think back about what we've learned, how we've learned it, and what compass, moral compass or lack of moral compass we have, you can see this coming. One of the important costs of ethical failures is chaos. The next most important thing to me is how it affects people and relationships, and how it can destroy and undermine the best efforts of a group of people to design and deploy a product or service that they think meets the requirements of their target audience. These are failures that take generations to renew. I've noticed because of political conflict, economic policy, higher education policy. I noticed things 20, 30, 40 years ago, and I'm sure those of you that are practitioners in the quality management field and in IT have noticed the same kinds of things. I remember reviewing the Agile methodologies and scaled Agile. And one of the first things I said was, this is one of the most gameable things I've ever seen, because it's a great effort to bring order and discipline to the process, particularly of IT development. The problem is it's gameable. You can get around it. And it creates an awareness that's often not there. And there are a lot of statistics on this. It fails to hit the target about 60% of the time. I began to study the principles behind Agile and Agile development, and there are 12, I think, operating principles. And it was amazing to me how wonderful they were, and how they almost perfectly parallel a lot of the principles of quality management that Deming and Duran and Crosby and others um, have really modeled in a very specific way that has impacted their industry clients. So I was really surprised how something that was intended to be really good was being skewed off target sometimes. Looking back at just the things we've talked about today in my presentation about education and so on, we find out that 50% of the people that had graduated with 4-year degrees from American universities, 50% of them, and these were people that had matriculated through various disciplines, could not pass a basic literacy exam. And that exam would be to read a paragraph and to describe what the topic of that paragraph was. Or it would be on the mathematical, the logical side, they would take a menu from a restaurant and say, how much is a hamburger and a salad? And without writing it down and without using a calculator, tell me what the total is. They couldn't do it 50% of the time. Those are examples, but they were thorough reviews by the American Institutes um, for Education. And so these were indisputable. And it shocked industry. But if they had looked at the uh, policies within higher ed and all these other places we've been talking about, they shouldn't have been surprised. They could have seen it coming. So those of us that are engaging in this discussion can bring together our various levels of vocational certainty and all the different domains that we represent and all the experience we have. And some of these things are predictable, maybe not in specificity, but in general, that we have to be aware of them and be prepared. AI risk management is pretty simple. A risk is a situation involving exposure to danger. It's a safety issue, whether it's on paper safety or on human safety. I remember a program where there was this explorer and he always would say, danger, 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 get back. This snake will bite you and kill you. And so how often do you have to pick up the snake and get bitten before you begin to realize that it's a situation involving exposure to danger? Risk management is the forecasting and evaluation of financial or other risks together with the identification of procedures to avoid or minimize their impact. The ultimate goal is, yes, let's get this right. But there's a built-in goal, and that is to decrease the potential risk for solutions that create unintended consequences that affect our safety and our well-being, that affect us financially, emotionally, that bring chaos into our work processes, and that really, in many ways, can divide, split, and contaminate our business relationships. There are 3 principles of law that apply to the management of risk. And again, this is because we have to discover risk. We can sort of anticipate risk. We can, to some degree, forecast risk and its potential, depending on what um, process knowledge we have, what historical profiles that we have, and the data that it supplies. But the 3 principles of law are, first of all, discovery. When do we discover or become aware of the fact or event and then become legally responsible for it? So let's just talk about not just our own moral responsibility, but the legal responsibility that we have in the workplace. This is going to be very fuzzy in the future. How they're going to litigate some of these things is going to be an interesting exercise in mankind's recalibrating what's important to them. But discovery begins as soon as we are told by a third person. We see it or hear it with our own eyes and ears. It's in a memo. It doesn't matter. But discovery is where the responsibility begins. And then we're going to be asked to explain how we express due diligence in reacting to that discovery by giving every fact, event, or problem the diligence it is due. If you're in a courtroom and defending your actions from legal liability, everything you say and do is going to be measured by what is reasonable, what any reasonable person would say or do in that situation. There are standards for behaviors in some fields. There are known processes. There are known legal cases. There are all kinds of things you get from everything from insurance companies to regulatory authorities that tell us danger, danger, danger. There's a safety issue here. As soon as you discover one of these facts, you have to exercise due diligence and do what is reasonable. what any reasonable person would say or do in the same situation. And so, you may have 12 or 9 people in a jury box determining how reasonable what you did was, and they may not be experts as you are, but and there's a new level of responsibility that we see occurring more often, is that not only did you know, but you should have known, even without that event. You should have known because you're at a certain level and you carry a certain responsibility, and the processes you've managed require you to operate at this higher level of situational awareness. An intelligent system is the reasonable pairing of competent, well-prepared humans and technologies to improve outcomes. Barclay R. Brown, my friend and colleague, we were sitting in a restaurant in Long Beach, California one night, and we were discussing the pairing of intelligent, well-prepared, vocationally certain individuals with the technologies that we're dealing with at that time. And we were having these discussions within the context of several seminars and webinars that we'd been both presenters and participants and listeners, and how the people that we were hearing respond were having trouble deciding what was the highest priority. And as we spoke about this, it became very clear to us that there's not going to be any substitute for a human being properly prepared, competent, ethical, and particularly ethical as a determinant factor in all systems. We can't create in a technological framework what a human can do. We can do it faster sometimes. We can do it more broadly in terms of research. It's a wonderful tool, and it's close to a final determinant. Somebody was talking about earlier, should AI be used to release lethal power? Well, maybe not. Maybe a human who has to consider factors from a sentient point of view, and maybe even from a spiritual point of view, but for sure a moral point of view, needs to be the determining factor, the determinant in this interaction that is going to be growing with these high technologies, whether it's just AI, but AI applied to robotics and so on and so forth, where we have servants running around our house here very soon, not very far away, that are entirely robotic and trainable, and with levels of accountability and levels of production and delivery that are quite unusual. So we're moving into a new world. Barclay wrote a lot about this in his book, Engineering Intelligent Systems. I recommend that you take a look at that. So safe systems requirements are all over the board. AI safety encompasses technical approaches and principles for designing AI systems that are robust, reliable, and align with human goals. I'll repeat that align with human goals to prevent harm and ensure beneficial outcomes. An ethical human being prepared properly is not replaceable. It can be replaced, but it's not replaceable. The distinction is the outcomes and the consequence of replacing someone in a determinate factor by a programmed piece of technology, no matter how excellent it is. And we know it's going to reduce errors. It's going to reduce, even in transportation, it's going to reduce deaths and dismemberments and all kinds of horrible morbidities and so on in healthcare. And it has tremendous upside, but it has the downside that if we presume that we can replace human beings and their ethical dependability in this process, that we will encounter and endure problems well beyond anyone could have anticipated other than folks like us. So thank you for this.